In the year of 1847, after a 1,000-mile exodus, Mormon pioneers reached modern-day Utah's Great Salt Lake Valley, which was at the time claimed by Mexico. They viewed this territory as their promised land, where they could live in peace with their beliefs and build up a community. In the following years and decades, the newly arrived Mormons spread all across what is now the state of Utah. But this land was not just empty and ready for the taking. Humans have been living in what is now Utah for 8,000 to 13,000 years, and in 1847 there were dozens of bands and tribes living all across Utah. They are usually divided into 5 groups, although there would have been multiple independent bands or tribes within these 5 groups, these being the Ute, Paiute, Goshute, Shoshone, and Navajo. Over the past 200 years of Native American and Mormon interaction, there have been treaties, battles, friendly interactions, displacement, and slavery. But for today's story, I'm going to focus on a specific skirmish between a Mormon militia and some Navajo warriors. The Navajo are a tribe that has inhabited the Four Corners region of the United States for somewhere around 700 years. They were well known for their sheep herding and were also fierce raiders, frequently raiding nearby Pueblo tribes, Mexican settlers, Comanches, Apaches, and their hated enemy, the Utes. This specific story comes from a book, Pioneer Stories, compiled by Preston Nibley. This story starts in the Pine Valley Mountains in modern-day Washington County, Utah. In these mountains, there is an area called the Mahoganies, because of it being covered with mahogany trees. Just north of the Mahoganies, there is a depression in the land called Indian Hollow. It was given this name after this event. Now, this story takes place in 1866, and during this time period, the Navajos were being forced to take the, quote, long walk to the Bosque Redondo Reservation, and were not permitted to return to their homeland until 1868. Between 2,500 and 3,500 Navajos died during this forced removal. The horrors of the long walk and Bosque Redondo deserve their own video. But for now, this time frame does leave some questions for today's story. The 3 possibilities I can think of are that this story simply has its dates wrong, that the Navajos in this story belong to a group who were able to avoid the long walk, or that the natives in this story were mistaken for Navajos and were actually Utes or Paiutes, although the story does claim them to be Navajo. In December of 1866, a 27-year-old man named Cyrus Hancock rode into the Mahoganies in search of a lost horse. After riding for some time, he was stopped by 3 native men. They were on foot, but they had positioned themselves in a way that blocked his escape. They claimed to be friendly and said that they just wanted some tobacco. Cyrus had none and told them this. One of the men searched him, and finding no tobacco or weapons to defend himself with, became bold and angry. One of the natives knocked an arrow in his bow and pointed it at Cyrus. The 3 men then began to argue in Navajo. When the man pointed his bow at Cyrus again and began to pull back, Cyrus jumped off his horse just in time to miss being shot. He took off, headed for Pine Valley, and the men chased after him, firing arrows the whole way, one arrow going through his arm above the wrist and another passing straight through his beard. After a little more than a mile, they were getting close to a wagon road, and the men stopped chasing Cyrus. Now on the road, Cyrus was found by a man named Mr. Cochee, who rushed him back to Pine Valley, where he had the arrow removed and began to heal. Immediately, a runner was sent south to St. George, Utah, where the local militia began to assemble and plan for a retaliatory attack. The militia was led by Captain James Andrus, and was made up of about 80 men. The next day, the men left, hoping to catch up with the Navajos. After a day of travel, the militia camped out near Pipe Springs. A man named Ammon M. Tenney was on lookout duty, and at around 4 a.m. he saw a faint light across the plains near Bull Rush, on the west side of the Kanab Gulch. He awoke a man named Sixtus E. Johnson, who was a corporal of the militia, and together they decided to wake Captain Andrus. Captain Andrus declared that the light must be from an Indian fire, and immediately woke the men and gave orders for them to get moving. Because of a convenient gully, the men were able to get within 150 yards of the Navajo, who were busy making breakfast. The men dismounted and began to approach the camp. They were not aware of the number of Navajos they were facing. The men suddenly fired, and the Navajos scattered into the bush. Yelled orders in Navajo were heard by the militiamen, and the Navajos came together and started retreating to the top of a neighboring ridge. They were making a stand, and the 2 groups began trading shots with each other. After a small gunfight, the captain ordered his men to remount. They were going to assault the ridge. The men charged up the hill with Captain Andrus leading the way. Ammon Tenney, who was at a different angle, saw a Navajo warrior in perfect position to shoot Andrus with his bow. He yelled, quote, "Look out, Captain, that Indian will kill you." Captain Andrus reined his horse, which threw up its head and took an arrow intended for its rider deep in the forehead. The fighting was now hand-to-hand and extremely intense. Eventually, the Navajos began to pull back, with most of them being killed. When the militiamen gathered, only 3 men had been lost. At a later date, after treaties had been signed with the Navajo, it was learned that 13 Navajo warriors had participated in the fight against 80 militiamen. They fought desperately and fiercely until only one of them was left alive, who made it back home to relate the news of the battle to his people.